Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great point. And I think one of the reasons that people do assume that this left-right dichotomy is natural or universal is because, unfortunately, historians have gone back and applied left-right thinking and a left-right framework to historical figures who did not use that language or that vocabulary themselves. So, as you know, for most of human history, human beings have had politics, but not the left-right spectrum. That's a relatively recent phenomena in human history. It dates back to the French Revolution, where the delegates to the Estates General met together, and later in the French National Assembly, when the delegates would meet together. And at that time, at the time of the French Revolution, there was one big issue that they were discussing and debating. And so a unidimensional spectrum kind of made sense to describe one big issue, and that was the French Revolution. Are you more or less in favor of this democratic revolution? And so it came to be seen that those who were more in favor of the revolution tended to be sitting on the left-hand side of if the speaker is looking at them, and those who were less in favor of the revolution or opposed to the revolution sat on the right-hand side. And so there was a kind of unidimensional spectrum running from left to right, being very in favor of the revolution, kind of in favor, kind of against, and very against the revolution. Well, that was used at the time in the 1790s to describe French politics, and it was kind of limited to that case, but it was picked up a bit in the 1800s by communist revolutionaries who wanted to see their project as a continuation of the French Revolutionary project. And so they thought of themselves as on the left, and people who opposed their revolution as being on the right. Most famously, this emerged during the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1910s, when Russian revolutionaries continued to use this language from the French Revolution and saw themselves as the revolutionaries being on the left and our opponents being on the right. Now, this, fortunately for the United States, Americans were unaffected by this. This was not the way Americans thought and talked about politics. If you go back and look at documents from the 1700s and the 1800s, you will not see the terms left and right used in a political sense. Now, you might come across, the phrase left wing or right wing as it relates to architecture or military formations, but not in terms of politics. But that changes, unfortunately, in the 1920s and 30s, when first journalists reporting on the Bolshevik Revolution start to adopt that framework in describing what was happening in Russia. Because they said, well, these are the way the Russian revolutionaries are talking about themselves, so we're going to report on that and explain to our American audience that there's this thing called left and right, and this is the way they describe their, kind of internecine socialist battles within the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, it kind of makes its way into elite discourse and describing American politics. In the 1930s, it made a little bit of sense in the American case because the one big issue facing America in the 1930s that everyone was discussing was the New Deal. Are you more or less in favor of FDR's New Deal? And so it started to be used in a way to say those who are really in favor of FDR's New Deal are on the left, those who are opposed to it are on the right. Now, notably, the people who were in favor of the New Deal were the ones who disseminated that framework, and they liked it. They thought of themselves as kind of democratic revolutionaries opposed to the oligarchy, opposed to the aristocracy. People who were opposed to the New Deal didn't like that framing, and they didn't really adopt it. And so you really only had one party using the language of progressive and conservative. Democrats were using that language, but Republicans really weren't. It didn't finally kind of become a part of the mainstream bipartisan American political discourse until the 1960s, when in 1964 the Republican Party for the first time nominated a presidential candidate who called himself a conservative. And so now you have Republicans adopting this left-right framing, and now you have both parties bought in. And so since the 1960s, it's really taken off exponentially in the United States. It's trickled down from kind of an elite phenomenon among historians and journalists and political scientists, where now ordinary people will use this language of left and right to describe our politics. And so today you can't turn on cable news or open a newspaper or read political news on the internet without people using this language of progressive and conservative, left versus right. And unfortunately, I don't think this is the only reason that our politics has become more hostile and angry and dysfunctional, but I think it's one of the reasons that our politics has become more angry and divisive, is because when people think of politics in terms of a unidimensional spectrum, even if they don't explicitly say it, they're implicitly acknowledging that there's one party that's correct about everything because all of their issue positions flow out of the correct philosophy, and there's one party that's wrong about everything because all their issue positions flow out of the wrong philosophy. And so even if they're not conscious of what's happening, implicitly they're assuming that there's a philosophy that has everything figured out and a philosophy that's wrong about everything. And so it causes, I think, our political discourse to become much more heated and angry than it would otherwise be if we didn't have that left-right framework. If we just talked about the issues, then I think people would recognize, oh, every person I meet from either party is going to be someone who I agree with on some things, I disagree with on some things. That's normal, that's human. Rather than saying, well, all I need to know is what side of the spectrum they're on, and then I know if they're an ally or an enemy.
Okay.